We don't gotta figure all this. We don't gotta figure all this out tonight. Finish out the summer. We'll see what happens.
See if you want to work out.
I'm saying we see how it goes later on.
Are you breaking up with me?
I don't see how it's gonna work.
Please don't do this. You don't mean it. Oh, hell, if you're gonna do it, why wait until the summer ends, huh? Why don't you just do it right now? Huh? Come on. Come on.
Do it.
Do it. Do it. Do it right now. Do it. No. Stop it. Oh. What?
Oh my goodness. Oh no, she didn't. You know what, that's one of my favorite romantic movies of all time, even though they have quite a violent relationship. But I have to say, it's very similar to the relationship between Kathy and Heathcliff in the novel Wuthering Heights. Okay, so I know The Notebook is not exactly like Wuthering Heights, but there are a lot of similarities to be made. What I don't want you to think is that Wuthering Heights is some lovey-dovey, sappy love story, okay? Because it's not. It's actually a very violent, twisted love story. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the background information today. So I have my notes here, so I'm going to kind of go back and forth between what's on the PowerPoint and what's in my notes. So if you see me looking over here, that's what I'm doing. So we have a lot to talk about, okay? One of the guiding questions I like to start with when you start Wuthering Heights is true love stronger than death? You know, is love capable of passing on to the next world or passing on to another life? Kind of like at the end of The Notebook, you know, where their love kind of conquers the death that they both face at the end. So just something for you to keep in mind and think about. So we're going back to the late 1700s, okay? And our two of our main characters, Kathy, or Catherine as she's formally called, and Heathcliff, are growing up together at Wuthering Heights. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's Wuthering Heights? Well, it's simply the name of their house. Okay, a lot of families, especially in the English countryside, who have bigger cottages and things like that, but that have been passed down from family to family, tend to have names. So a lot of houses in England are named. So the name of this house is simply Wuthering Heights. So don't get confused, it's just the name of the house. Now you might want to take note of that name Wuthering. If you look up Wuthering in the dictionary, it means very, something that's very windy and tumultuous and even dangerous. So it's a very weather-worn landscape. So hopefully that takes you back to Ethan Frome with a name like Starkfield. You know, it definitely has a symbolic significance. So they live out on the English moors, which we're going to talk more about those in a second. And Heathcliff arrives as a gypsy. Okay, and they refer to him as a gypsy because he's got darker skin, dark hair, and he looks kind of unkept. And he's a foundling, meaning he's an orphan. So Kathy's father, Mr. Earnshaw, who owns the home Wuthering Heights, he finds him on the street while he's in town one day and decides to adopt him as his son, which is kind of unheard of, but Mr. Earnshaw was a very generous and kind man, and so he felt sorry for Heathcliff and brought him home. But then he meets Kathy, who's very strong-willed, has a flair for the very dramatic, and she's extremely beautiful, but she also kind of has a wild side to her, which from someone from her social class is really not usual. She's not that ladylike, she's kind of more outspoken and wild. But of course Heathcliff is attracted to that. So a couple of other things you need to know, historically speaking, about the time period is that in England at the time this was written, or a little bit before, the Industrial Revolution was going on. So if you don't know anything about the Industrial Revolution, it was a time of really big social and economical changes. A lot of people were making money, a lot of businesses were being opened for the first time, and people who were in kind of the lower or middle class were beginning to make a lot of money. Therefore, they were moving up through the class system very quickly. So the structure of that began to change. You know, the upper class was no longer just wealthy men who had been rich for generations, you know, who had inherited wealth from an older family member or something like that. Because traditionally a gentleman was born that way. You know, you're a gentleman by birth. If you were born into a rich family, you were automatically a gentleman. But during the Revolution, that really did start to change. So, for example, Heathcliff, who starts out as this gypsy orphan, ends up eventually in the book making a lot of money. And he's a capitalist, so he kind of capitalizes on this revolution and decides to go make money while he can. But he's not like Edgar. Edgar Linton is more from the gentry class, the gentleman class, meaning his family has money, they've always had it, and he has it by birth. And then Hareton, who we're going to talk about later, represents kind of the farming class, that lower, between the lower and middle farming class. So that's kind of those three social classes are all represented somewhere in the book. Then one other thing, historically speaking, we need to know a little bit about women's rights at the time, because they didn't have many. So at the time Wuthering Heights was written, women did not have the right to vote nor property rights. So they weren't allowed to own property once they were married. If they were not married or they never got married, they could probably hold on to whatever property they owned. But under 19th century British law, married women could not legally own property. So when they got married, all the property that they owned or they inherited from parents or whatever became their husband's property. So a lot of women during that time period had to give up their ownership of property that could, value was a lot of money, and they had to give all that up when they got married. So they had to choose very carefully who they married so they could make sure that they could keep that kind of in their family and things like that. So they had to be careful with that. And those rights were definitely going to be brought up in the book. So Cathy and Heathcliff meet once Mr. Earnshaw brings him home, and they like to go roam around the moors together on the rocks and play outside, and they kind of form this soulmate-like bond. They just really connect together. But unfortunately, there's a lot of forces around them that are eventually going to start pulling them apart. So what starts out as a very strong friendship and relationship kind of starts to tear apart as the book goes on. So I've already talked a little bit about Catherine and Heathcliff, so let's meet the third person in our love triangle, because we have a lot of similarities in this book to Ethan Frome, one of them being we have another love triangle. And we've got Heathcliff and Catherine, they're already friends, but they have a neighbor. And their neighbors, the Linton family, again is from that genteel world, that upper class society that they've kind of been born and bred into. And they live in a house called Thrushcross Grange. So we've got Wuthering Heights, Earnshaw's house, then we have Thrushcross Grange, that's the Linton's house. And so Edgar, of course, introduces himself to Cathy and kind of starts to draw her into that world of riches and wealth and society, so she kind of becomes interested in that life. As far as the structure of the story, again, a lot like Ethan Frome, we learn Cathy and Heathcliff's story through flashbacks. So the beginning of the novel, Heathcliff is living at Wuthering Heights. He also owns Thrushcross Grange because he's allowing a gentleman named Mr. Lockwood to rent that home. And so the whole story is a frame story. It's a story within a story, yet again. So Mr. Lockwood, who's renting the home from Heathcliff, wants to know what's going on with this family. Why is Heathcliff so mean and miserable, and what happened to him that made him that way? So he asks his housekeeper. Her name's Nellie Dean, and she tells him the story. So the story is divided, depending on the chapter, between Mr. Lockwood and Nellie Dean, so you have to pay close attention to who's talking in the story. So Heathcliff is the master there, and he becomes rich, and he's obviously very mean when Mr. Lockwood meets him, so that's what he's trying to figure out. Just like in Ethan Frome, when the narrator sees him, he wants to know his story, what's going on here. So Wuthering Heights is a romantic tale of intense love, but it's also tragic. So it's not intense like a lovey-dovey story. It's the kind of love that leads to madness and destruction, and it's a very destructive force for all the characters. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. It's kind of a dark romance. And of course, just like in Ethan Frome, yet again, the connections are endless. The landscape of this novel is raw and powerful. It's a force. It's just like a character in the book. Just like the snow of Starkfield, the moors in Wuthering Heights are almost a character in themselves. So the novel takes place on the moors of Yorkshire in northern England. So they're kind of out, isolated away from town. We're not in the middle of a metropolis. It's very bleak and isolated. So a moor is like a large open area of land. So you can see in the visual there kind of a picture of the moors and what they look like. But it's very kind of jagged, and there's kind of there's usually rocks everywhere, and there's kind of these layers of decayed plants. So it's really a very desolate area. And a lot of times they're covered with something called heath, which is like a moss. But it makes it, just like I said, very isolated. You can kind of see it going out into the water. So if you're near the water, it's very turbulent. The weather is violent at times. So the setting is kind of a character in itself. Okay. And just a little bit about Emily Bronte. That's the author of Wuthering Heights. She lived most of her life in Yorkshire, so she wrote about where she lived. She was very isolated from society. She grew up with her sisters and one brother, and they played on the moors. They lived kind of in this fantasy world, and they really were only friends with each other. They didn't really get out much. They were very isolated as children, so she wrote, about what she knew. So not surprisingly, this is, what she used to inspire her novel. Although she was never married, she never had a boyfriend, she really never left her house. So for her to design this epic romantic novel is kind of ironic, considering she never really experienced any of those things, especially living out in the middle of nowhere. So a few final things. Elements of romanticism. This is considered to be part of the romanticism movement, where nature is a very powerful force. The countryside is described a lot, so you're going to read a lot of description. A constant elevated emotional level and passion. The characters are very emotional and very passionate. There's a lot of opposites in the book, so characters that are opposite of each other, so be looking for those. A strong interest in death, isolation, then of course we have those supernatural elements, again, just like we talked about with Gothicism. So this is also considered to be a Gothic novel. So a lot of times there's going to be haunted places, death, madness, a villain. A lot of times the heroine or the female lead character is going to be wooed or courted by a good guy and a bad guy. So she's kind of stuck in the middle between the two. And the biggie, in all caps, revenge. That's going to be a major element to the novel. And then the Byronic hero. The Byronic hero was named after a famous poet, Lord Byron. And the Byronic hero is similar to a tragic hero, but he has, conflicting emotions. He's very moody and emotional. He kind of has a troubled past. We don't know where he came from or what happened to him. He doesn't like social institutions. He doesn't like people telling him what to do, what to wear. He kind of does his own thing. But he's also very self-destructive. So you have to kind of watch out for those characters. You want to like them, but they're also very destructive at the same time. So it's called a Byronic hero. And this story has a lot of characters. We're tracing, 2 generations of families over 30 years. So there's a lot. So I'm giving you a character chart, so that you can keep up with that. But it is going to be intense to keep up with the characters. So make sure that you know who's who in the story, but I'll help you with that. So we're ready to get started. Wuthering Heights, right? A Victorian romance for the ages. A little bit better than The Notebook and definitely more dramatic. So stay tuned. And here we go.